Sometimes life sends you exactly what you need, even when it comes in a form you never expected. In a dusty frontier town, people learned this truth when a giant coyote wandered into their barn one morning. The creature was massive, with silver fur and eyes like storm clouds. Every townsman who saw it felt something deep in their bones, a mix of wonder and caution that kept them at a safe distance. No one wanted to deal with this wild beast. Then Kael stepped forward. The Apache tracker had been living quietly on the edge of town, keeping to himself like he always did. But when he looked at that coyote, something changed in his weathered face. He pointed at the animal and said simply, "He's mine." The coyote walked straight to him. What made this lonely tracker claim a creature that everyone else feared? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Copper Ridge as Kael Running Wolf made his way down the dusty main street. His moccasins moved silently over the wooden boardwalk, a habit from decades of tracking that he couldn't shake even in town. The leather fringe on his buckskin jacket swayed with each step, and the worn medicine pouch at his belt caught the light, a pouch that had belonged to his grandfather and held sacred stones blessed by Apache elders long gone. At 53, Kael carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had seen too much and learned to find peace in solitude. His weathered face told stories of desert winds and mountain storms, while his dark eyes held depths that most folks in Copper Ridge preferred not to explore. He was useful when they needed tracking done, lost cattle, missing persons, or the occasional outlaw trail. But when the work was finished, they were content to let him return to his small cabin on the outskirts of town. The medicine pouch pressed against his hip as he walked, a constant reminder of the traditions his grandfather had tried to pass down before the world changed forever. Inside were 4 sacred stones, one for each direction, blessed with prayers for protection and guidance. His grandfather had been a respected medicine man among their people, but those days seemed like stories from another lifetime now. "Morning, Kael," Sheriff Morrison called from the porch of his office. The lawman was a decent sort, one of the few who treated Kael with genuine respect, rather than the polite wariness most showed. Morrison had fought in the war and understood something about carrying burdens that others couldn't see. "Sheriff," Kael nodded, touching the brim of his hat. The gesture was automatic, learned from years of navigating the careful balance between two worlds. The town was stirring to life around them. Martha Brennan swept the porch of her saloon, her grey hair pinned back severely, but her eyes kind. She'd lost her husband to Apache raids 20 years ago, yet she'd been one of the first to welcome Kael when he'd settled here. Doc Henley emerged from his office, medical bag in hand, probably heading to check on the Morrison baby who'd been running a fever. These people had become something like family to Kael, though he'd never voiced such thoughts aloud. After losing his wife and daughter in the conflicts that had torn his people apart, he'd thought his heart was too scarred for new connections. But time and small kindnesses had a way of healing wounds you thought were permanent. His cabin sat a mile outside town, positioned where he could watch the approaches from 3 directions, another old habit that served him well. The structure was simple but well-built, with a small corral for his horse and a garden where he grew traditional medicines alongside practical vegetables. The Apache way was to take only what was needed and to give back more than you took. Every morning, Kael would rise before dawn and perform the prayers his grandfather had taught him. He would face each direction, acknowledging the spirits of the wind, the earth, the water, and the fire. The ritual connected him to something larger than the daily concerns of frontier life, something that had sustained his people through generations of change and hardship. The tracking work came naturally to him. Reading sign was like reading words on a page. Each bent blade of grass, each scuff mark in the dirt, each broken twig told part of a story. He could follow a week-old trail across rocky ground that would stump most men, and he'd never lost a person he was hired to find. The skill had kept him alive during the worst years of the Apache Wars, and it kept him useful now in this uneasy peace. But usefulness and acceptance were different things. Kael understood that he would always be the Apache tracker to most folks, never simply Kael the neighbor or Kael the friend. The distinction didn't anger him anymore. Anger was a luxury he'd given up long ago. Instead, he found satisfaction in doing his work well, and in the quiet moments when someone like Martha or Sheriff Morrison treated him as simply another human being. His horse, a sturdy paint named Cedar, whickered softly as Kael approached the corral. The animal had been with him for 8 years now, a gift from a grateful rancher whose daughter Kael had found after she'd wandered off during a thunderstorm. Cedar was more than transportation. He was a companion who understood the value of comfortable silence. The cabin's interior reflected Kael's dual heritage. Traditional Apache items, his grandfather's war lance, a medicine shield, and several beautiful baskets woven by his late wife, shared space with practical frontier furnishings. A well-maintained rifle hung above the fireplace, and shelves held books on everything from local geology to veterinary medicine. Kael had taught himself to read as a young man, recognizing that knowledge was another kind of weapon in a changing world. On the mantel sat a small framed photograph, one of the few luxuries he'd allowed himself. It showed his wife, Elena, and their daughter, Maria, taken in Santa Fe just months before the fever took them both. Elena's smile was radiant, and 7-year-old Maria had her mother's eyes and her father's stubborn chin. Some nights, Kael would catch himself speaking to the photograph, sharing the small events of his day as if they were still there to listen. The loss had nearly broken him. For months after their deaths, he'd wandered the mountains like a ghost, seeking either healing or an honorable death. The spirits had granted him neither, instead leading him to Copper Ridge and this strange half-life among people who needed his skills but would never fully accept his presence. Yet gradually, he'd found a different kind of peace. Not the deep contentment he'd known with Elena and Maria, but something quieter and more reflective. He'd learned to find meaning in small things. A successful tracking job, Martha's nod of greeting, the way Sheriff Morrison always asked after his health without making it seem like charity. The medicine pouch contained more than sacred stones now. Over the years, he'd added a small braid of Eleanor's hair, a button from Maria's favorite dress, and a piece of turquoise from the place where they'd first met. These personal talismans mixed with the traditional ones, creating something new, a bridge between who he'd been and who he was becoming. As the sun climbed higher, Kael prepared for another day of the careful balance he'd mastered. He would be helpful but not intrusive, skilled but not threatening, present but not presumptuous. It was a lonely way to live, but it was the path that had been laid before him, and he'd learned to walk it with dignity. The giant Coyote stood motionless in the center of Brennan's barn, silver coat gleaming in the shafts of morning light. Kael had never seen anything like it. The creature was easily twice the size of any coyote he'd encountered, with an intelligence in its storm-gray eyes that made his breath catch. When he'd pointed and claimed the animal, something had passed between them, a recognition that went deeper than words. Now, leading the massive coyote toward his cabin, Kael felt the weight of curious and fearful stares from every window and doorway in Copper Ridge. The animal walked beside him with calm dignity, never pulling at the makeshift rope lead, never showing aggression toward the people who gathered to watch their strange procession. "Stormwalker," Kael said quietly, the name coming to him as naturally as breathing. The coyote's ears pricked forward at the sound, and those intelligent eyes fixed on his face with what could only be described as approval. Back at his cabin, Kael removed the rope entirely. Stormwalker sniffed around the small corral, investigated the garden, then settled on the porch as if he'd always belonged there. When Kael brought out a bowl of water and some jerky, the coyote accepted both with dignified gratitude, eating slowly and watching the surrounding desert with alert attention. The first strange incident happened that very afternoon. Mrs. Patterson's prize hens had gotten loose again, as they did every few weeks when her arthritis prevented her from properly securing their coop. Usually it took hours to round up the scattered birds, but today they were found arranged in a perfect circle around her, well, calm, and apparently unharmed. No one could explain how they'd gotten there, or why they'd stayed put. Sheriff Morrison arrived at Kael's cabin just before sunset, his expression troubled. "Kael, I need to ask you something, and I want a straight answer." "Always give you straight answers," Kael replied, settling into the wooden chair on his porch. Stormwalker lay at his feet, alert but relaxed. "That animal of yours, it wasn't anywhere near the Patterson place today, was it?" Kael shook his head. "Been here all afternoon, why?" Morrison explained about the hens, and Kael felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. He looked down at Stormwalker, who was watching the sheriff with those unnervingly intelligent eyes. "There's something else," Morrison continued, lowering his voice. "Stranger came through town this afternoon, asking questions about unusual animals. Wouldn't give his name, but he had that government look about him. Said he'd heard reports of wolves in the area. "No wolves around here for 20 years, Kael said. "That's what I told him. But he seemed mighty interested when I mentioned your new companion." Morrison's hand rested on his gun belt, not threatening, but ready. "Kael, if there's something you're not telling me about this animal—" A child's scream cut through the evening air, high and terrified. Both men were on their feet instantly, but Stormwalker was already moving, flowing down the porch steps like liquid shadow and racing toward town. Kael and Morrison followed, but the Coyote's speed was inhuman. They found Stormwalker in the schoolyard, standing protectively over 7-year-old Tommy Chen, who was pressed against the base of a cottonwood tree. A massive rattlesnake lay coiled nearby, but something was wrong with its posture. It seemed dazed, confused, as if it had forgotten why it was there. "Easy, Tommy," Kael called, approaching slowly. "Don't move." But Stormwalker was already handling the situation. The Coyote moved toward the snake with fluid grace, and incredibly, the rattler began to uncoil and slither away into the brush. Not fleeing in fear, but responding to some silent communication that made Kael's skin prickle. Tommy scrambled to his feet and ran to his mother, who had arrived with half the town behind her. Mrs. Chen gathered her son close, her eyes wide with shock and gratitude as she looked at Stormwalker. "That snake should have struck," Doc Henley said, breathing hard from his run. "It was coiled and ready. I've never seen anything like it." Stormwalker returned to Kael's side, settling down as if nothing unusual had happened. But Kael noticed that several of the townspeople were looking at his companion with a mixture of awe and unease. That night, Kael dreamed of running through moonlit canyons, his feet barely touching the ground as he raced alongside wolves and coyotes under a star-drunk sky. In the dream, he understood their speech, felt their thoughts as clearly as his own. Ancient voices whispered in Apache, speaking of guardians and sacred duties, of spirits that walked between worlds. He woke with the taste of wild sage on his tongue and the sound of howling in his ears, though the desert outside was silent over breakfast. Stormwalker watched him with those two knowing eyes, and Kael found himself speaking aloud to the animal as he would to an old friend. "What are you really?" he asked, offering a piece of bacon. Stormwalker accepted the food, but never broke eye contact. "And why do I feel like I've been waiting my whole life for you to show up?" The coyote's response was to rest his massive head against Kael's knee, a gesture so filled with affection and trust that Kael felt his throat tighten with unexpected emotion. By noon, the town was buzzing with talk. Some folks were calling Stormwalker a miracle, crediting him with saving Tommy Chen's life. Others whispered about witchcraft and evil spirits, crossing themselves when they saw Kael and his companion walking down Main Street. Martha Brennan was in the first camp. "That animal's got the sense God gave him," she declared, refilling Kael's coffee cup. "More sense than some people I could mention." But Ezra Blackwood, who ran the general store, leaned away when Stormwalker passed by his window. "Ain't natural," he muttered to anyone who'd listen. "Coyotes don't act like that. Something's wrong with it." The division in the town made Kael uneasy. He'd worked hard to build a peaceful existence here, and Stormwalker's presence was threatening that carefully maintained balance. The mysterious stranger returned on the third day, and this time he wasn't asking casual questions. Agent Porter, as he introduced himself, was a lean man in a dark suit with eyes like chips of winter ice. He found Kael at Martha's place and invited himself to sit down. "Mr. Running Wolf, I represent the United States government, and I'm here about your animal." "My animal isn't bothering anyone," Kael replied carefully. "That creature is the property of the federal government," Porter said, producing an official-looking document. "It escaped from a classified facility 6 months ago, and we've been tracking it ever since." Kael felt Stormwalker tense beneath the table where the coyote had been resting at his feet. The animal's hackles rose, and a low growl rumbled in his throat, the first aggressive sound Kael had heard him make. "He's not going anywhere," Kael said quietly. Porter's smile was cold as a grave. "I'm afraid that's not your decision to make." That evening, Kael sat on his porch with his grandfather's journal spread across his lap, searching for answers in the faded Apache writing. Stormwalker lay beside him, occasionally lifting his head to scan the desert for threats that only he could sense. The ancient petroglyphs map tucked between the journal's pages caught the lamplight, carved stone that his grandfather had pressed into his hands years ago with urgent whispers about sacred sites and guardian spirits. The journal entries spoke of shapeshifters and spirit animals, of times when the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds grew thin. His grandfather had been a respected medicine man, keeper of old stories that most people now dismissed as superstition. But sitting here with Stormwalker, feeling the animal's otherworldly presence, those stories didn't seem so far-fetched. "According to this," Kael said softly, running his finger along the Apache script, "there were guardians who protected the sacred places, spirits that could take animal form when the people needed them most." Stormwalker's ears pricked forward, and he moved closer, as if trying to read the ancient words himself. Agent Porter had left town after their confrontation, but not before making it clear that he'd be back with reinforcements. The man's presence had left a chill in the air that had nothing to do with the desert evening. Kael had dealt with government officials before. They usually meant trouble for people like him. The dreams had intensified since Porter's visit. Each night, Kael found himself running through landscapes that seemed both familiar and impossible. Ancient ceremonies unfolded in his sleeping mind, with Apache elders speaking in the old tongue about responsibilities that passed from generation to generation. In these dreams, Stormwalker was always beside him, but not as a coyote, as something larger, more luminous. With eyes that held the wisdom of centuries, Doc Henley stopped by the next morning, ostensibly to check on Stormwalker's health, but really to satisfy his scientific curiosity about the animal's unusual behavior. "I've been practicing medicine for 30 years, the doc said, running his hands carefully over Stormwalker's silver coat. "Never seen anything like this. His heartbeat is slower than it should be for an animal this size, and his body temperature runs about 3 degrees cooler than normal." "Is he sick?" Kael asked, though Stormwalker appeared to be in perfect health. "Opposite, actually. Everything about him suggests enhanced vitality." "And there's something else." Doc Henley hesitated, then continued. "Yesterday, when I was treating Mrs. Morrison's rheumatism, she mentioned that her pain completely disappeared when your friend here wandered by her window. Thought you should know." Kael filed that information away with all the other strange occurrences that had begun accumulating since Stormwalker's arrival. The animal's presence seemed to have a calming, healing effect on both people and other animals. Even the most skittish horses settled when he was near. 3 days after Porter's departure, Stormwalker led Kael to a hidden canyon about 10 miles north of town. The coyote had been restless all morning, pacing and whining, until Kael finally saddled Cedar and followed where Stormwalker wanted to go. The petroglyphs were there, just as the map had indicated, ancient Apache symbols carved into the red sandstone walls. But these weren't the simple hunting and weather marks that Kael was familiar with. These told a story, and the more he studied them, the more his blood ran cold. The images showed coyotes and wolves standing alongside human figures, protecting what appeared to be sacred sites from invaders wearing the distinctive uniforms of American soldiers. Other panels depicted ceremonies where humans and spirit animals merged their essences, becoming something greater than either could be alone. At the center of the largest panel was a symbol that made Kael's heart race, the same mark that his grandfather had carved into the medicine pouch now hanging at his belt. A circle containing a coyote and a human figure, their forms intertwined in eternal partnership. "This is about us, isn't it?" Kael whispered, looking at Stormwalker. The coyote sat perfectly still, watching Kael with those ancient eyes. "My family has been connected to yours for generations." That afternoon brought news that chilled Kael to the bone. Sheriff Morrison rode out to the cabin with word that Agent Porter had returned with a full federal marshal, escort and official papers, demanding Stormwalker's immediate surrender. "They're setting up at the hotel," Morrison said, his weathered face grim. "Porter claims that Animal is government property and that you're harboring stolen federal assets." "Stormwalker isn't property," Kael said firmly. "He's a living being who chose to stay with me. I agree with you, but the law's the law. They'll be here tomorrow morning with warrants and enough firepower to level this place if necessary." Stormwalker had been listening to their conversation, and now he moved to stand beside Kael, pressing his massive body against the tracker's leg in a gesture of solidarity and protection. That night, Kael performed the sacred ceremony his grandfather had taught him, burning sage and sweet grass while speaking the old prayers to the four directions. Stormwalker sat within the smoke circle, perfectly still except for his eyes, which seemed to glow within a fire in the flickering light. During the ritual, images flooded Kael's mind, not dreams this time, but memories that belonged to Stormwalker. He saw laboratories filled with cages, men in white coats injecting animals with substances that glowed like liquid starlight. He felt Stormwalker's confusion and pain as they tried to bind his spirit to their machinery, to turn a sacred guardian into a weapon. The memories showed Stormwalker's escape, not through cunning or strength alone, but by calling upon powers that his captors couldn't understand or control. He had walked through walls like mist, had run across hundreds of miles without tiring, had followed an ancient calling that led him inevitably to Kael. "They don't own you," Kael said when the visions faded. "They captured you, hurt you, but they never owned you. Spirits can't be owned." Stormwalker's response was to place one massive paw on the petroglyphs map, covering the symbol of the eternal partnership between human and guardian. As dawn approached, Kael made his decision. He gathered supplies for a long journey, loaded his rifle, and prepared to defend what he'd come to. Understand was more than just an animal companion. Stormwalker was a sacred trust passed down through generations of his people. Martha Brennan arrived just as the sun crested the mountains, driving her wagon loaded with food and ammunition. "Heard you might be having visitors today," she said gruffly, though her eyes were kind. "Figured you could use some support." Soon after, Doc Henley appeared, then several of the Mexican families from the south side of town, and finally, even a few of the cowboys from the Henderson Ranch. Not everyone in Copper Ridge was ready to stand against the federal government, but enough were willing to make Porter think twice about using force. Stormwalker surveyed the gathering with approval, his tail swishing slowly as he recognized that the community was choosing to protect him rather than surrender him to those who would cage him again. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test everything Kael believed about duty, loyalty, and the sacred bonds that connected all living things. Agent Porter arrived with the dawn, bringing 4 federal marshals and enough chains to bind a grizzly bear. But as his group crested the hill overlooking Kael's property, they found themselves facing an unexpected sight. Half the town of Copper Ridge standing in protective formation around the cabin, many of them armed. Sheriff Morrison stepped forward, his badge catching the morning light. Agent Porter, you'll need to state your business before proceeding onto private property. Porter's cold eyes swept over the gathered townspeople with obvious disdain. These civilians need to disperse immediately, Sheriff. This is federal business. These civilians are my constituents, Morrison replied evenly, and they have every right to witness government actions in their community. From his position on the porch, Kael watched the standoff develop while Stormwalker remained calm beside him. The silver-tipped arrow his great-grandfather had carried into battle now rested across Kael's knees, a family heirloom that had been blessed by Apache medicine men, and was said to always find its target when, defending the innocent, Martha Brennan called out from her position near the corral, "Agent Porter, maybe you'd like to explain to these good people why the federal government is so interested in one coyote." Porter's jaw tightened. "That animal is the result of classified research. It escaped from a secure facility and represents a potential threat to public safety." Threat? Doc Henley stepped forward, his medical bag in hand. "That animal saved a child's life 3 days ago. What kind of threat does that make him?" Stormwalker had been listening to the conversation with obvious intelligence, his ears tracking each speaker. Now he rose and moved to stand at the edge of the porch, his massive form silhouetted against the cabin wall. Even the marshals seemed to hesitate at the sight of him. He was clearly no ordinary coyote. During the tense standoff, Kael began to understand something that had been eluding him. When he placed his hand on Stormwalker's head, images flooded his mind, not chaotic visions this time, but clear communication. The coyote was showing him scenes from the hidden laboratory, revealing the truth about what had been done to him. Stormwalker hadn't been created by government scientists. He'd been captured as a young pup from sacred Apache lands and subjected to experiments designed to enhance his natural abilities. The researchers had been trying to create military assets using traditional medicines stolen from Native American tribes. Medicines that had been blessed for spiritual purposes, not warfare. The process had nearly killed him. But Stormwalker's spirit had been too strong to break. Instead of becoming a weapon, he'd become something unprecedented, a bridge between the physical and spiritual worlds, capable of healing and protection in ways the scientists never intended. Through their mental connection, Stormwalker shared his memories of escape. He'd used his enhanced abilities to free not only himself, but several other animals from the facility. The silver-gray coyotes that local ranchers had been reporting weren't wolves at all. They were Stormwalker's offspring and companions, all seeking to return to the sacred lands where they belonged. "You're not alone out here," Kael murmured, understanding flooding through him. "Your pack is coming." Agent Porter was growing impatient with the standoff. "I have federal warrants, Sheriff. That animal comes with us, and anyone who interferes will be arrested for obstruction of justice." "Then you'll have to arrest half the county," said a voice from the crowd. Jake Henderson, the biggest rancher in the area, stepped forward with several of his cowboys behind him. "That coyote helped us find my missing cattle last week, led us right to them, then disappeared like smoke. We owe him." More voices joined in, each person sharing their own story of Stormwalker's protective presence. The animal had been quietly helping the community in ways that Kael was only beginning to understand. But Porter was unmoved by their testimonials. He signaled to his marshals, and they began advancing toward the cabin with their nets and chains. That's when Stormwalker demonstrated abilities that defied natural law. As the first marshal reached the porch steps, Stormwalker simply faded. His form became translucent, like morning mist, and the chains passed harmlessly through his body. The marshal stumbled forward, grabbing at empty air, while Stormwalker rematerialized behind him. Gasps and exclamations rose from the crowd. Even Porter's confidence seemed to waver as he witnessed something that no government training had prepared him for. "What in God's name?" one of the marshals whispered. Stormwalker flowed like liquid shadow around the advancing men, never threatening them, but making it clear that their chains and nets were useless against him. When Porter himself tried to corner the Coyote, Stormwalker simply walked through the cabin wall and emerged on the other side, his form solid once again. "He's not just enhanced," Doc Henley breathed. "He's something else entirely." The demonstration lasted only minutes, but it changed everything. Porter's marshals were backing away now, their faces pale with shock. Several townspeople were making signs against evil, while others dropped to their knees in what looked suspiciously like prayer. Kael felt a moment of fear, not of Stormwalker, but of what would happen now that the Coyote's true nature had been revealed. He'd lived his entire life trying to bridge two worlds, and he knew how quickly wonder could turn to fear, especially when people felt confronted with powers they couldn't understand. But Martha Brennan, bless her practical soul, summed up the situation perfectly. "Well, I'd say that settles the question of ownership. Can't cage something that can walk through walls." Porter was clearly shaken, but his determination hadn't wavered. "This changes nothing. That creature is even more dangerous than we thought. I'm calling for specialized containment units." "You do that," Sheriff Morrison said firmly. "But until you come back with new warrants that account for what we just witnessed, you're trespassing on private property. I suggest you move along." As Porter and his men retreated, Stormwalker returned to Kael's side, solid and calm, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But Kael could feel the animal's exhaustion. Using those abilities took a toll, and Stormwalker wouldn't be able to maintain such displays indefinitely. That evening, as the supportive townspeople gradually dispersed, Kael sat with Stormwalker and tried to process what had occurred. The silver-tipped arrow lay across his lap, and he found himself thinking about his great-grandfather's stories of warriors who fought alongside spirit guides. "We're running out of time, aren't we?" he asked. Stormwalker's mournful whine was answer enough. Through their growing mental connection, Kael understood that Stormwalker was dying. The experiments had extended his life and enhanced his abilities, but they'd also created an imbalance that was slowly consuming him from within. He had perhaps weeks, maybe days, before his spirit would be forced to leave the physical world entirely. The government would return with new weapons, new strategies for containing something that defied their understanding. And when they did, Stormwalker might not have the strength to resist them. Kael made a decision that night, one that would change both their lives forever. If Stormwalker was destined to return to the spirit world, then Kael would help him complete whatever mission had brought them together. The petroglyphs had shown a sacred partnership between human and guardian. Perhaps it was time to discover what that truly meant. The hidden valley lay beyond 3 ridges of red sandstone, accessible only through a narrow canyon that seemed to fold in on itself. Stormwalker had led Kael there in the pre-dawn darkness, moving with the urgency of an animal running out of time. As they emerged into the secluded basin, Kael understood why his companion had been so insistent about making this journey. Scattered across the valley floor were the remains of a government facility that had been abandoned in obvious haste. Concrete buildings sat half-collapsed, their roofs caved in by years of neglect and desert storms. Rusted vehicles dotted the landscape like metal bones, and everywhere there were signs of a hasty evacuation, documents blowing in the wind, equipment left to decay in the harsh sun. But it was what Kael found among the debris that made his blood run cold. A military dog tag, tarnished and bent, lay half-buried in the sand, near what had once been the main laboratory. The name etched into the metal read, Sergeant Michael Torres, U.S. Army Medical Corps, along with dates that indicated he'd died defending this place less than a year ago. Stormwalker led him deeper into the ruins, his massive form moving with reverent care among the scattered remnants of scientific ambition. In what had been the central laboratory, Kael found filing cabinets that had been torn open, their contents strewn about by wind and scavenging animals. But some documents had survived, protected by metal desk drawers that had jammed shut during the facility's destruction. The papers told a story that made Kael's hands shake as he read. The government hadn't been creating enhanced animals. They'd been capturing and torturing sacred beings, trying to understand and replicate spiritual powers that had protected Native American tribes for centuries. Stormwalker had been taken as a pup from the very canyon where Kael's grandfather had performed healing ceremonies, torn from his pack and subjected to procedures designed to bind his spirit to human control. They stole sacred medicines from our people, Kael whispered, reading a researcher's notes about plant compounds gathered from unoccupied tribal lands. The irony was bitter. They'd used Apache spiritual traditions to try to create weapons against the very people those traditions were meant to protect. Stormwalker's story emerged from the scattered files like a nightmare painted in clinical language. The experiments had enhanced his natural abilities, but they'd also created an artificial barrier between him and the spirit world. He was trapped between realms, too powerful for the physical world, but unable to return to the spiritual plane where he belonged. The research had a darker purpose than simple military enhancement. Hidden in the deepest files, Kael found plans for something called Project Sacred Eagle, a program designed to capture and weaponize every spirit guardian protecting Native American sacred sites across the Southwest. Stormwalker had been the prototype, the proof of concept for turning protective spirits into instruments of conquest. Among the debris, Kael found evidence of what had happened to end the project. Sergeant Torres hadn't died in an accident or from natural causes. He'd been killed trying to help Stormwalker and the other captured spirits escape. The sergeant's final report, written in shaky handwriting on the back of a requisition form, told of his growing horror at what they were doing to creatures that he'd come to recognize as more than animals, spirits with souls older than our country. Torres had sabotaged the containment systems and died fighting the security forces that tried to stop him. His sacrifice had allowed Stormwalker and several other spirit animals to escape, but the damage to their spiritual essence had already been done. Most of the freed spirits had died within weeks, their life force consumed by the artificial barriers that prevented them from returning home. Stormwalker was the sole survivor, and he was dying slowly, day by day, as his spirit fought against the bonds that held him to the physical world. But the most chilling discovery came in Agent Porter's personal files. The man pursuing them wasn't just a government bureaucrat. He was Dr. Richard Porter's son, and Dr. Porter had been the lead researcher on Project Sacred Eagle. The elder Porter had died in the facility's destruction, killed by the very spirits he'd tortured for years. His son had inherited both his position and his obsession with completing the project. Agent Porter wasn't trying to recapture Stormwalker for national security. He was driven by a need to vindicate his father's work and prove that spirit guardians could be controlled and used as weapons. The younger Porter had convinced his superiors that Stormwalker represented a threat that only he understood how to contain. As Kael pieced together the truth, Stormwalker grew weaker. The journey to the valley had exhausted him, and his magnificent silver coat was beginning to fade, becoming translucent in patches where his spirit was pulling away from his physical form. His breathing was labored, and when he looked at Kael, there was a desperate sadness in those ancient eyes. "You brought me here to show me the truth," Kael said, kneeling beside his companion. "But there's more, isn't there? Something you need me to understand." Stormwalker's response was to place his massive paw on the petroglyphs map that Kael carried. The ancient symbols seemed to pulse with warmth beneath the Coyote's touch, and suddenly Kael could see the connections he'd been missing. The sacred sites marked on the map weren't just ceremonial locations. They were anchors that kept the boundary between worlds stable. Each site was protected by a guardian spirit, and those guardians were all connected in an intricate network that maintained spiritual balance across the entire region. By capturing and torturing Stormwalker, the government had damaged that network, creating weaknesses that were slowly spreading. The other spirit animals that ranchers had been reporting weren't Stormwalker's offspring. They were guardians from other sites, drawn to this area by spiritual distress, calls that humans couldn't hear. They were trying to heal the damage, but without Stormwalker's return to the spirit realm, their efforts were doomed to failure. The prophecy his grandfather had spoken of wasn't about a single guardian, protecting one location. It was about restoring the entire network before the damage became irreversible. And that restoration required a willing human partner, someone who could bridge the gap between physical and spiritual worlds. As understanding dawned, Kael felt the weight of generations settling on his shoulders. His family line had been guardians for the sacred sites for centuries, working in partnership with spirits like Stormwalker to maintain the balance that kept both worlds safe. The Apache Wars, the forced relocations, and the systematic destruction of Native American traditions had broken that partnership, leaving the spiritual guardians vulnerable to capture and exploitation. "You need me to help you get home," Kael said, his voice thick with emotion. "But getting you home means—" Stormwalker's gentle whine confirmed what Kael already knew. Restoring the Guardian network would require more than just Stormwalker's return to the spirit realm. It would require a human guardian to anchor the connection, someone willing to sacrifice their earthly life to maintain the bridge between worlds. The broken dog tag in Kael's hand seemed to grow heavier as he realized that Sergeant Torres had understood this truth in his final moments. The soldier had died trying to undo the damage his government had caused, but he hadn't possessed the spiritual knowledge necessary to complete the restoration. As night fell over the ruined valley, Kael made a decision that felt as inevitable as sunrise. He would help Stormwalker return home no matter the cost. The sacred responsibilities of his ancestors called to him across the years, and he would not fail them as the government had failed its own people. The Apache elders lived in a hidden settlement high in the Chiricahua Mountains, their presence known only to a few trusted souls who still honored the old ways. Kael had visited them twice before, once as a young man seeking guidance after his family's death, and once to return sacred items that had been stolen from a burial site. Now he came as a supplicant, carrying Stormwalker in his weakening condition up treacherous mountain paths that would have challenged a healthy man. Stormwalker could barely maintain his solid form for more than a few minutes at a time. The magnificent Coyote flickered in and out of visibility like a candle in strong wind, his spirit fighting desperately to remain anchored to the physical world. Each phase transition left him more exhausted, and Kael could feel his companion's life force ebbing with every labored breath. The settlement appeared to be nothing more than natural rock formations until you knew how to look. The elders had built their homes into the mountain itself, using traditional construction techniques that made them nearly invisible from any distance. It was a place that existed partially outside the normal world, sustained by ceremonies and spiritual practices that reached back to the beginning of time. Maria Delgado, the eldest of the medicine women, greeted them at the settlement's entrance. Her ancient face was mapped with lines that spoke of nearly a century of wisdom, and her dark eyes saw truths that younger people missed entirely. She took one look at Stormwalker's flickering form and made a sound of deep sorrow. "You bring the lost guardian to us," she said in accented English, her voice carrying the weight of prophecy. "But you come too late, grandson. The artificial bonds are too strong. There has to be something we can do," Kael said, his voice breaking as Stormwalker collapsed against his legs, unable to maintain even a sitting position. "The sacred healing crystals, my grandfather spoke of them. Ancient stones that could heal any spiritual wound." Maria's expression softened with compassion. "The crystals exist, but they require a price that few are willing to pay. To heal the Guardian, a human soul must take his place in the space between worlds. Someone must anchor the bridge so that he can cross over." She led them to a ceremonial chamber carved deep into the mountain's heart, where walls covered in ancient pictographs seemed to pulse with inner light. At the chamber's center lay 4 crystals the size of a man's fist, each one representing one of the sacred directions. They glowed with soft radiance that seemed to respond to Stormwalker's presence. brightening whenever he drew near. "Your great-grandfather helped create these," Maria continued, settling cross-legged beside the crystals. "He understood what the coming times would bring. The wars, the relocations, the attempts to destroy our spiritual connections. He and the other medicine men bound their own life force into these stones, so that future generations might have the power to restore what was lost." Other elders gathered in the chamber. As word of their arrival spread, Thomas Yazzie, keeper of the war stories, spoke in rapid Apache to Maria before turning to Kael. "Stormwalker is not the only guardian who needs healing. 6 others came to us over the past months, all damaged by the government's experiments. 3 have already passed into the spirit realm, but they could not complete their crossing. They remain trapped in the space between worlds, growing weaker each day." Kael felt the full magnitude of what they faced settling over him like a heavy cloak. This wasn't about saving one spirit animal. It was about restoring an entire network of guardians that protected sacred sites throughout the Southwest. The ceremony would require not just the sacrifice of one human life, but the willing participation of someone who could bridge both worlds with understanding and love. "There's something else," Maria said quietly. "The agent who pursues you, he comes with more than marshals this time. Our watchers report military vehicles, specialized equipment for capturing spirits. They will arrive within 2 days. Agent Porter's obsession with completing his father's work had escalated beyond simple recapture. Through sources in the tribal government, the elders had learned that Porter was preparing to use Stormwalker as bait to draw in the other escaped guardians. He intended to complete Project Sacred Eagle by capturing every spirit guardian in the region and binding them to government control. Stormwalker's condition deteriorated rapidly as they prepared for the healing ceremony. He could no longer maintain solid form for more than seconds at a time, and when he did materialize, his silver coat had faded to the color of morning mist. His breathing came in shallow gasps that seemed to echo from somewhere far away, and his ancient eyes held a resignation that broke Kael's heart. The healing ritual required 3 days of preparation. Each dawn, Kael joined the elders in purification ceremonies that cleansed both body and spirit. They burned sacred herbs gathered from the 4 directions, sang ancient songs that called upon the spirits of their ancestors, and painted his skin with symbols that would protect him during the crossing between worlds. On the 2nd day, Doc Henley arrived at the settlement, having followed their trail with the determination of a man driven by conscience. He found Kael sitting beside Stormwalker in the ceremonial chamber, both of them surrounded by the soft glow of the healing crystals. "I had to come," Doc said, settling his medical bag beside him. "That animal saved lives in our town. If there's any way I can help, there is," Maria interrupted, studying the doctor with shrewd eyes. "The ceremony requires a witness from the outside world, someone who can carry the story of what happened here. The government will try to cover up the truth, but the people need to know about the guardians and the price of protecting them." Stormwalker stirred at the sound of Doc's voice, managing to lift his massive head long enough to fix those knowing eyes on the physician's face. In that moment, understanding passed between them, not the full spiritual communication that Kael experienced, but something simpler and more profound. Recognition of one healer by another. That evening, Martha Brennan arrived with a wagon full of supplies and a fierce determination to see this through to the end. Behind her came Sheriff Morrison, several of the Mexican families who had supported them, and even a few cowboys from the Henderson Ranch. Word had spread through unofficial channels that Kael and Stormwalker were making their final stand, and these good people had come to offer whatever help they could. "Can't let you face this alone," Martha said gruffly, unloading food and ammunition with equal efficiency. "That Coyote's part of our community now. We protect our own." The gathering transformed the hidden settlement into something unprecedented, a meeting place where Apache traditions merged with frontier practicality, where ancient wisdom guided modern loyalty. The elders welcomed the outsiders with cautious respect, recognizing that the old divisions between peoples meant nothing when faced with the government's attempt to weaponize the sacred. As night fell on the second day, Stormwalker rallied enough strength for one final demonstration of his guardian powers. A flash flood, triggered by unseasonable rains in the high country, threatened to wash away the settlement's lower buildings. But Stormwalker rose from his resting place like a spirit of the storm itself, his form blazing with silver light as he called upon powers that reached deep into the earth and sky. The floodwaters parted around the settlement as if striking an invisible barrier. Trees that should have been uprooted remained standing, and buildings that should have been swept away stood firm against the torrent. For nearly an hour, Stormwalker held back the flood through sheer force of will, protecting everyone in the settlement, Apache and Anglo alike. When the danger passed, Stormwalker collapsed completely, his spirit form barely visible even in the crystal's glow. The effort had consumed nearly all of his remaining strength, leaving him with perhaps hours instead of days. He could have saved himself, Maria said softly, tears running down her weathered cheeks. He could have used that power to break the bonds holding him to this world. Instead, he chose to protect us one last time. Kael knelt beside his failing companion, placing his hand on the spot where Stormwalker's heart should be. Through their connection, he felt the Guardian's fading consciousness, still focused not on his own suffering, but on the network of sacred sites that remained unprotected. Tomorrow, Kael promised. Tomorrow we finish this. The final night before the ceremony, Kael sat alone with Stormwalker in the crystal chamber, speaking quietly about the life they might have shared if circumstances had been different. He talked about the tracking jobs they could have done together, the peaceful evenings on his cabin porch, the simple companionship that had meant more to him than all his years of solitude. Stormwalker's response was a faint warmth against his mind, gratitude mixed with sorrow, love tempered by the knowledge that their time together had always been limited. The Guardian had come to him not just seeking help, but offering a final gift, the chance to complete the sacred duty that Kael's bloodline had carried for generations. As dawn approached, bringing with it the ceremony that would either save the Guardian network or destroy them all, Kael found peace in knowing that he would not face the crossing alone. Stormwalker would be beside him, just as he had been since that first morning in Brennan's barn, when destiny had brought them together. The healing ceremony began at sunrise, with Kael and Stormwalker positioned at the center of the crystal formation while the elders chanted in the ancient tongue. But as Maria placed the sacred healing crystals around Stormwalker's fading form, something unexpected happened. The crystals didn't just glow, they revealed truth. Hidden within their crystalline depths were images that rewrote everything Kael thought he understood about Stormwalker's nature. The visions showed not a coyote enhanced by government experiments, but an ancient guardian spirit who had walked these lands for thousands of years, protecting the sacred sites and the people who honored them. The government files Kael had found in the abandoned facility told only part of the story. Dr. Porter and his team hadn't created Stormwalker. They had captured him during a ceremony meant to renew the guardian bonds that protected Apache sacred sites. The experiments had been desperate attempts to understand and control a being whose existence challenged everything they thought they knew about the world. Maria's voice rose above the chanting, speaking in English so that the assembled townspeople could understand. The crystals show his true memory now. See how he has protected these mountains since before the white man came, since before our own people learned to plant corn and build homes of stone. The images flowing from the crystals painted a history that stretched back centuries. Stormwalker had been known by many names across many generations. Silver Runner, Stormbringer, the protector of the four sacred mountains. He had appeared in times of great danger to defend both the land and its people, regardless of their tribal affiliation or the color of their skin. But the most shocking revelation came when the crystals revealed the truth about Kael's family lineage. His bloodline hadn't just been connected to guardian spirits. They had been the bridge between the human and spirit worlds for over 300 years. Each generation had produced someone capable of communicating with the Guardians, helping to maintain the delicate balance that kept both realms safe. Kael's great-grandfather hadn't simply been a medicine man. He had been Stormwalker's human partner during the Apache Wars, helping the Guardian spirit protect refugee camps and guide families to safety. When the great-grandfather died, the connection had been temporarily broken, leaving Stormwalker increasingly isolated from the human world. The government's capture of Stormwalker hadn't been a random scientific endeavor. Dr. Porter had discovered references to Guardian spirits in confiscated Apache documents and had become obsessed with harnessing their power for military purposes. His experiments hadn't enhanced Stormwalker's abilities. They had tried to sever his connection to the spirit realm entirely, trapping him in physical form where he could be controlled and studied. "My father spent his whole life hunting a legend," a familiar voice said from the chamber's entrance. Agent Porter stood silhouetted against the morning light, but his usual cold demeanor had been replaced by something that looked almost like awe. He never understood what he was really dealing with. The assembled townspeople tensed for confrontation, but Porter raised his hands in a gesture of peace. Behind him stood not federal marshals, but a mixed group of scientists and tribal elders, including several faces that Kael recognized from reservation councils. "The files you found in the facility," Porter continued, stepping into the crystal's glow, "they were my father's attempt to rationalize something that couldn't be rationalized. He documented the experiments, but he never understood that he was torturing a being older than our entire civilization." Maria studied the agent with ancient eyes that seemed to see through his soul. "You carry your father's guilt, but not his hatred. Why have you come here?" Porter's voice cracked with emotion as he answered. "Because I found his real journals, the ones he never filed with the government. In his final months, my father realized what he'd done. He tried to reverse the process, to free Stormwalker and the other Guardians. That's how he really died, not in an equipment failure, but trying to undo the damage he'd caused." The agent pulled a hidden government file from his jacket, its cover marked with classifications that even most military personnel would never see. "This contains the truth about Project Sacred Eagle. It wasn't just about creating enhanced animals, it was about systematically capturing every Guardian spirit in the Southwest and turning them into weapons for territorial expansion." Stormwalker stirred weakly at Porter's presence, his fading consciousness recognizing something in the agent that surprised even Kael. Through their mental connection, Kael felt not hostility, but a complex mixture of forgiveness and understanding. Stormwalker had known Dr. Porter's true nature. In those final days at the facility, had felt the scientists' growing horror at what he'd participated in. "The experiments weren't trying to enhance Stormwalker," Porter explained, his words heavy with inherited shame. "They were trying to break his spirit so completely that he could never return to the Guardian network. My father believed that destroying the spiritual protections would make Western expansion easier for the government." The revelation sent shockwaves through both the Apache elders and the assembled townspeople. The systematic destruction of Native American spiritual traditions hadn't been just cultural genocide. It had been a coordinated attack on forces that protected the land itself. But the most profound truth was yet to come. As the healing crystals reached full resonance, they revealed that Stormwalker's capture and torture had damaged more than just his own connection to the spirit realm. The Guardian network that protected sacred sites throughout the region had been critically weakened, leaving entire areas vulnerable to spiritual corruption. The strange weather patterns that had been affecting the Southwest, the increasing violence between different groups of settlers, even the unusual frequency of natural disasters, all of it could be traced back to the imbalance created when Stormwalker was forcibly separated from his role as the network's primary anchor. "Other spirit animals across the region have been dying," one of the tribal elders with Porter's group reported. Sacred sites that have been protected for generations are losing their power. If Stormwalker cannot be restored to his proper place in the network, the damage will become irreversible. Thomas Yazzie stepped forward, his weathered face grave with understanding. The prophecy speaks of this time, when the Guardians would face their greatest trial, when the choice between worlds would determine the fate of all sacred places. The crystals pulsed brighter, and suddenly Kael could see the entire Guardian network as Stormwalker perceived it, a web of spiritual energy connecting sacred sites across thousands of miles, with Stormwalker as the central node that kept all the connections stable. The network was failing. Other Guardians were dying trying to compensate for Stormwalker's absence. And time was running out. But restoration would require more than just healing Stormwalker's individual wounds. The artificial bonds created by the government experiments had to be severed completely, allowing him to return to his role as the primary Guardian. And that severance could only be accomplished by someone willing to take Stormwalker's place in the space between worlds, someone who could anchor the human side of the connection while Stormwalker resumed his spiritual duties. Agent Porter's final revelation changed everything. "I didn't come here to capture him," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I came to help finish what my father started, to help free him completely, no matter what it costs." The choice that had seemed inevitable now became a shared responsibility. Both Kael and Porter understood that their families' legacies, one as protectors, one as destroyers, had led them to this moment where they could work together to heal the damage that government arrogance had caused to the spiritual world. The sacred collar appeared as the first rays of sunlight touched the healing crystals, materializing from what seemed like pure starlight and ancient memory. Woven from silver threads that had never touched earthly metal and turquoise stones that held the blue of infinite skies. It represented the final bond between Guardian and Spirit Realm. Beautiful, powerful, and irreversible, Maria lifted the collar with trembling hands, her ancient voice speaking truths that made every person in the chamber understand the magnitude of what they faced. This was created by the first Guardians, back when the world was young and the barriers between realms were thin. Once placed around Stormwalker's neck, it will restore his full Guardian powers, but it will also bind him to the spirit realm forever. Kael knelt beside Stormwalker's fading form, feeling the weight of destiny settling over them both like a heavy blanket. Through their mental connection, he sensed the Guardian's mixture of longing and sorrow. Stormwalker wanted desperately to return to his proper role, to heal the damaged network and protect the sacred sites, but leaving the physical world meant leaving Kael behind forever. "I understand," Kael whispered, placing his hand on the spot where Stormwalker's heart flickered between beats. "We both knew this day would come." Agent Porter stood at the chamber's edge, no longer the cold government official, but a man carrying the weight of his father's sins and his own chance at redemption. He'd brought more than just revelations. Hidden in his jacket were official documents that would shut down any remaining government attempts to capture Guardian spirits, signed by officials who finally understood the catastrophic consequences of interfering with forces they couldn't comprehend. But Porter's most valuable contribution was tactical intelligence. "The specialized containment units I mentioned are already en route," he warned. "My former colleagues don't know I've changed sides, and they're bringing equipment specifically designed to disrupt spiritual energy. If they arrive before the ceremony is complete, they won't," Martha Brennan interrupted, with the fierce certainty of a woman who decided to stake everything on one final battle. "We've got folks positioned at every approach to this mountain. They'll have to go through half the county to reach us." The townspeople had indeed prepared for war, but this would be unlike any conflict they'd ever fought. Sheriff Morrison coordinated with the Apache warriors who'd arrived during the night, men who understood both modern tactics and ancient spiritual warfare. Doc Henley had set up a field hospital for the wounded, while the Mexican families had created supply lines that could sustain a lengthy siege. But the real preparation was happening in the ceremonial chamber, where Kael underwent the Guardian bonding ceremony that would allow him to anchor Stormwalker's crossing between worlds. The ritual required him to open his consciousness completely, becoming a bridge between physical and spiritual realms, while Stormwalker shed his earthly form. The process was unlike anything Kael had ever experienced. As the elders painted sacred symbols on his skin, with paint made from blessed earth and guardian tears, he felt his awareness expanding beyond the boundaries of his individual self. He could sense the other guardians throughout the region, some healthy and strong, others weakened by the network's instability, all of them waiting for Stormwalker's return to restore the balance. Thomas Yazzie spoke the ancient words that bound guardian and anchor together. As the mountains give strength to the rivers, as the sky gives breath to the earth, so shall the human spirit give anchor to the guardian's crossing. What is joined in sacred purpose cannot be broken by earthly force. Stormwalker's response was to place his massive paw over Kael's heart, their mental connection deepening until Kael could feel the Guardian's memories as clearly as his own. Centuries of protection, countless acts of quiet heroism, the love for this land and its people that had sustained Stormwalker through generations of change and conflict, all of it flowed between them, creating a bond that transcended individual existence. The ceremony reached its climax as Maria placed the Guardian's collar around Stormwalker's neck. The silver and turquoise blazed with inner fire, and suddenly the Guardian's fading form stabilized, his magnificent silver coat returning to full brilliance as his true nature was restored. But the transformation brought immediate consequences. Stormwalker's enhanced Guardian powers made him a beacon that could be sensed by every spiritual entity within hundreds of miles. The Guardian spirits began converging on the mountain, drawn by the call of their restored network anchor. Some came as allies, but others arrived carrying the spiritual corruption that had spread during the network's weakness. "It's beginning," Agent Porter said, checking his radio equipment. "My former unit just reported unusual animal activity throughout the region. They're mobilizing everything they have to reach us before." His words were cut off by a sound that made everyone in the chamber freeze, the distant rumble of military vehicles climbing the mountain roads, accompanied by the distinctive whine of helicopters carrying specialized equipment. Sheriff Morrison burst into the chamber, his face grim with urgency. "They're coming up 3 different routes, at least 40 vehicles total. And they're not just trying to capture Stormwalker anymore. They're planning to destroy this entire site to prevent what they're calling a spiritual insurgency." The government's final solution to the Guardian problem had been revealed. If they couldn't control the spirits, they would eliminate the sacred sites entirely, breaking the network permanently and removing any future threat to their expansion plans. Kael felt Stormwalker's fury at this revelation, a righteous anger that blazed through their connection like wildfire. The Guardian's restored powers responded to his emotions, causing the crystals around them to pulse with dangerous energy. Other Guardians were arriving now, wolves, eagles, bears, and coyotes that moved with otherworldly grace and purpose. "The ceremony isn't complete yet," Maria warned, her voice cutting through the rising tension. "Stormwalker has the collar, but the final crossing requires perfect balance between human anchor and Guardian spirit. If we're interrupted before the bonding is finished, we won't be interrupted," Kael said with calm certainty. Rising to his feet, he felt Stormwalker's power flowing through him, enhancing his human senses until he could perceive the approaching threat with crystal clarity. "This is what we've been preparing for." The final battle for the Guardian network was about to begin, and it would determine not just Stormwalker's fate, but the future of every sacred site in the American Southwest. Government forces armed with spiritual disruption technology would face Guardians wielding powers older than human civilization, while the people of Copper Ridge fought to protect something they didn't fully understand but had learned to respect. As Stormwalker rose to his full magnificent height, collar blazing with starlight and ancient purpose, Kael placed his hand on the Guardian's shoulder and spoke the words that would bind them together for whatever came next. As one spirit in two forms. We stand ready. The mountain itself seemed to pulse with anticipation, and in the distance, the sound of approaching engines grew louder as destiny rushed toward them with the inevitability of dawn. The spirit lance materialized in Kael's hands as the first government vehicles crested the mountain ridge, its ethereal form pulsing with the combined will of every guardian spirit that had ever protected these sacred lands. Carved from condensed starlight and bound with threads of pure intention, the weapon represented the fusion of human determination and spiritual power that the government had tried so desperately to control and destroy. Stormwalker stood beside him in his fully restored guardian form, no longer the fading Coyote who had wandered into Brennan's barn, but a magnificent spirit warrior whose silver coat blazed within a fire. The Guardian's collar had completed his transformation, connecting him once again to the vast network of sacred sites, while allowing him to channel powers that made the earth itself tremble with anticipation. The attacking force spread across the mountainside like a mechanical plague, armored vehicles carrying specialized equipment designed to disrupt spiritual energy. Helicopters loaded with containment nets that could supposedly hold a guardian spirit, and soldiers armed with weapons that fired concentrated bursts of what the government called reality stabilization fields. Agent Porter's former colleagues had come prepared for war against the supernatural, but they had fundamentally misunderstood what they were fighting. This wasn't a battle between technology and superstition. It was a confrontation between forces that sought to control the sacred and those who existed to protect it. The first shots came from the helicopters, energy weapons that would have devastated normal animals or even enhanced creatures. But Stormwalker simply flowed around the attacks like silver mist, his guardian form untouchable by tools designed to bind physical matter. The reality stabilization fields passed harmlessly through him, while he moved with liquid grace toward the nearest aircraft. Kael felt every movement through their spiritual bond. His human consciousness merged with Stormwalker's ancient wisdom until they fought as a single entity with two forms. The spirit lance in his hands responded to their combined will, extending into a weapon that could strike targets hundreds of yards away while protecting their allies from the government's technological assault. Other guardian spirits emerged from the sacred sites throughout the region, drawn by Stormwalker's call to defend their ancestral responsibilities. Wolves that ran like flowing shadow, eagles whose wingspans blocked out the sun, bears whose roars shook the mountain's foundations, all of them converging on the battle with purposes that transcended individual survival. The townspeople who had come to support Kael and Stormwalker found themselves fighting alongside creatures from Apache legend, defending a cause that bridged the gap between human community and spiritual tradition. Sheriff Morrison coordinated with wolf packs that responded to hand signals, while Martha Brennan found herself loading ammunition for warriors who could communicate with eagles circling overhead. But the government forces had come prepared for supernatural opposition. Their equipment included devices that could temporarily solidify spirit forms, making the Guardians vulnerable to conventional weapons. Several of the arriving spirits fell to concentrated fire, their ancient essence dispersing back to the sacred sites they had left unprotected. Stormwalker's fury at these losses blazed through his connection with Kael, threatening to overwhelm the human anchor's consciousness with primal rage. The Guardian's restored powers made him capable of devastating the entire government force, but unleashing such destruction would damage the very balance they were trying to restore. "Control," Kael whispered through their bond, his human wisdom tempering Stormwalker's spiritual wrath. "We protect, we don't destroy. That's what separates us from them." The reminder steadied both of them, refocusing their combined power on precise defensive actions rather than overwhelming offense. Stormwalker used his abilities to shield the other Guardians, while Kael directed the Spirit Lance's energy to disable vehicles and equipment without killing the soldiers inside. Agent Porter moved through the chaos with grim determination, using his knowledge of government tactics to guide the defenders' efforts. His radio crackled with frantic communications from his former unit as their technological advantages proved useless against opponents who existed partially outside the normal laws of physics. Target the command vehicle, Porter called to Kael, pointing toward an armored truck whose array of antennas and dishes suggested it was coordinating the entire assault. Destroy their communications, and the rest of the force loses cohesion. Stormwalker flowed toward the indicated target like liquid lightning, his form becoming pure energy as he passed through the vehicle's armor and systematically disabled its electronic systems. The sudden loss of coordination sent ripples of confusion through the government ranks, but their field commanders quickly adapted, falling back on more primitive but reliable tactical approaches. The battle intensified as both sides committed their full resources to victory. The sacred sites began glowing with accumulated spiritual energy as their guardian protectors channeled power through the restored network. Ancient Apache spirits rose from their resting places to join the fight, while the mountain itself seemed to pulse with awareness and purpose. Through it all, Kael felt the weight of his ancestors' expectations and the promise of a future where sacred places could exist without fear of government exploitation. The spirit lance in his hands grew heavier with each guardian spirit that fell, but also stronger with each act of protection he and Stormwalker accomplished together. The first phase of the battle was ending, but the real test lay ahead. Agent Porter's former colleagues were preparing to deploy their most devastating weapon, one designed to sever the connection between guardian spirits and their sacred sites permanently. The binding stone emerged from the mountain's heart as the government's final weapon activated, a crystalline formation that pulsed with the accumulated spiritual energy of every sacred site in the region. But its appearance came with a terrible choice that neither Kael nor Stormwalker had anticipated. The stone could complete the Guardian's transformation and restore the network permanently, but only if someone willingly surrendered their connection to both the physical and spiritual worlds. Agent Porter stood at the center of the chaos, his hands shaking as he held a device that could either heal or destroy everything they'd fought to protect. His father's final journal had contained instructions for reversing the Guardian experiments, but the process required a sacrifice that no one could make lightly. "My father discovered the truth too late," Porter shouted over the sound of battle, his voice cracking with emotion. He wasn't trying to enhance the Guardians. He was trying to break their connection to the sacred sites so completely that the network would collapse forever. He died trying to stop his own project when he realized what he'd unleashed. Stormwalker's magnificent form flickered as the binding stone's power flowed through him, offering the completion he'd sought while demanding a price that would separate him from Kael forever. Through their spiritual bond, Kael felt the Guardian's anguish. Stormwalker could save the network and restore protection to all the sacred sites, but doing so would trap him in the spirit realm permanently, with no possibility of return. "Choose," Kael said firmly, his voice steady despite the tears streaming down his face. "I won't hold you back from your destiny." But Stormwalker's response was to turn away from the binding stone, his ancient eyes fixed on something beyond the immediate battle. The Guardian had sensed a deeper truth. Agent Porter wasn't just offering redemption for his father's crimes. He was preparing to take the place that Kael had been destined to fill. "It should be me," Porter said, stepping toward the binding stone with resolute determination. "My family caused this damage. My family should pay the price to repair it." The revelation of Porter's true intention sent shockwaves through both forces. His former colleagues turned their weapons on him, recognizing that their commanding officer had not just changed sides, but was preparing to sacrifice himself to protect the very entities they'd been sent to destroy. Stormwalker moved to shield Porter from the incoming fire, his guardian powers deflecting energy weapons and physical projectiles alike. But the effort of protecting multiple targets while maintaining his own transformation was pushing even his restored abilities to their limits. The binding stone pulsed brighter, its crystalline facets reflecting scenes from possible futures, some showing the sacred sites protected and thriving, others revealing a world where spiritual balance had been lost forever. The choice between these realities hung in the balance of the next few moments. Through their connection, Kael felt Stormwalker making a decision that transcended individual desire. The Guardian understood that saving the network required not just his own return to the spirit realm, but the willing participation of someone who could bridge both worlds with perfect understanding. Someone who had learned to love what they were protecting, rather than simply fearing what they'd destroyed. Both of us. Stormwalker's mental voice whispered through their bond. The bond between Guardian and Anchor was always meant to be permanent. We cross together, or we fail separately. Agent Porter reached the binding stone as his former unit's final assault reached its crescendo. The device in his hands, his father's last attempt at redemption, began resonating with the stone's frequency, creating a harmonic that could either heal the damaged network or shatter it beyond repair. "I understand now," Porter said, his voice carrying across the battlefield with unexpected clarity. "The Guardians were never our enemies. They were protecting something we didn't know we needed, the balance between human ambition and natural wisdom." He activated his father's device, and the binding stone blazed with light that made the sun seem dim by comparison. Stormwalker's collar responded to the energy surge, connecting him fully to the Guardian network while offering Kael the choice to remain in the physical world or follow his companion into the realm. Between realms, the government assault faltered. As their equipment failed in the face of spiritual energies they hadn't learned to measure or contain. Soldiers who had come to capture dangerous animals found themselves witnessing something that challenged their understanding of reality itself, the restoration of a protective network that had existed since before their civilization began. Stormwalker looked at Kael one final time, his ancient eyes holding infinite love and infinite sorrow. The Guardian's choice was made. He would complete the crossing and restore the network, but he would do so as himself, not as a weapon or a tool for others' ambitions. Kael placed his hand on the binding stone beside Agent Porter's, feeling the mountain's heartbeat through the crystalline formation. The choice was simple. Let Stormwalker cross alone and probably fail, or anchor the transformation with human love and lose his earthly life in the process. "Together," Kael said, his voice steady with acceptance. "The way it was always supposed to be." The binding stone accepted their combined sacrifice, and the Guardian network blazed to life across the entire Southwest, restoring protection to sacred sites while banishing the spiritual corruption that government interference had created. Stormwalker's transformation reached completion as Kael felt his own consciousness expanding beyond individual existence, becoming part of something vast and eternal. 6 months after the battle that restored the Guardian network, Kael stood at the edge of his old property, watching the sunrise paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. The Guardian's promised stone rested warm in his palm, a smooth river rock that appeared whenever Stormwalker's spirit drew near, proof that their bond had transcended the boundaries between physical and spiritual existence. The transformation had changed everything. Yet in some ways, life in Copper Ridge had returned to a familiar rhythm. The town prospered under the renewed protection of the sacred sites, with fewer accidents, better harvests, and a sense of peace that seemed to settle over the entire region like morning dew. But those who had witnessed the battle carried memories that would shape the rest of their lives. Agent Porter had survived the binding stone ritual, though he emerged from it fundamentally changed. The government had officially transferred him to a new position, director of a program designed to protect rather than exploit the spiritual sites throughout the American West. His first official act had been to classify the locations of all known Guardian sites, making them permanently off-limits to military research or development. Never thought I'd see the day when a federal agent would be asking Apache elders for advice on policy. Sheriff Morrison had commented during one of Porter's regular visits to Copper Ridge. The former adversary had become one of the community's most valued friends, bringing resources and protection from a government that had finally learned to respect what it couldn't control. Martha Brennan's saloon had become an unofficial museum of the events, with framed photographs and personal accounts from everyone who had participated in defending the sacred sites. Visitors came from across the country to hear the stories and learn about the guardian spirits that protected the land. Martha treated each guest with the same gruff hospitality she'd always shown, but her eyes held new depth, the wisdom of someone who had seen the sacred manifested in the ordinary world. Doc Henley had documented the healing properties that now emanated from the restored sites, publishing papers that challenged medical science to expand its understanding of wellness and recovery. Patients who visited the protected areas showed remarkable improvement in both physical and spiritual ailments, leading to the establishment of the first government-sanctioned healing centers based on traditional Native American practices. But it was the changes in Kael himself that marked the true success of the Guardian restoration. He moved through the world with the quiet confidence of someone who had found his purpose and fulfilled it completely. Though he appeared unchanged to casual observers, those who knew him best could see the deeper transformation. He carried himself like a man who existed comfortably in multiple worlds simultaneously. Stormwalker's presence was a constant but gentle reality. The great guardian appeared most often at dusk and dawn, his silver form running alongside Kael during his walks through the desert or resting peacefully on the porch during quiet evenings. Children from the town had learned to bring small offerings when they visited, wildflowers, interesting stones, or simple drawings that Stormwalker accepted with dignified approval. The Guardian network hummed with renewed vitality throughout the Southwest. Other spirit guardians had returned to their posts, and the sacred sites blazed with protective energy that kept both the land and its people safe from threats both natural and human. The government's attempts to interfere with spiritual forces had ended permanently, replaced by policies that acknowledged and protected the sacred traditions that had sustained the region for centuries. Kael had established a school for young people who showed aptitude for communicating with guardian spirits, teaching them the responsibilities and wisdom that his grandfather had passed down to him. Students came from many backgrounds: Apache, Mexican, Anglo settlers, and others who felt called to serve as bridges between human communities and the spiritual forces that protected them. The first graduates of the Guardian School were already taking their places throughout the region, working with local communities to establish respectful relationships with the spirit protectors of their areas. These new guardians carried forward the lesson that Kael and Stormwalker had embodied, that true strength came not from controlling spiritual power, but from serving it with humility and love. On this particular morning, as Kael prepared for another day of teaching and guidance, Stormwalker materialized beside him with unusual clarity. The great guardian's form was more solid than usual, his ancient eyes bright with purpose and affection. Through their eternal bond, Kael sensed that Stormwalker was preparing for a long journey, not a departure, but an expansion of his protective duties to include sacred sites that had been left unguarded for too long. Other guardian spirits had requested his help in restoring connections that had been severed by decades of government interference and cultural suppression. "How long will you be gone?" Kael asked, though he already knew the answer through their shared consciousness. Stormwalker's response came not in words, but in the warm certainty that their separation would be temporary. The Guardian's duties might take him far from Copper Ridge, but the bond they shared would call him home whenever the network faced new threats or when Kael needed his presence. As they stood together, watching the sun climb higher into the desert sky, Kael reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. What had begun as a lonely tracker claiming a mysterious coyote had evolved into something far greater, a partnership that had restored balance to the spiritual world while teaching both human and guardian communities to work together in harmony. The promised stone grew warm in Kael's hand as Storm Walker began to fade, his magnificent form becoming translucent in the morning light. But before he disappeared entirely, the Guardian approached Kael one final time, pressing his massive head against the man's chest in a gesture of eternal affection and gratitude. "Until we meet again," Kael whispered, and Stormwalker's spirit bounded away across the desert, his silver form catching the sunlight like liquid starfire as he began the next phase of his endless mission to protect the sacred places of the world. Standing alone, but never truly alone, Kael felt the weight and joy of his chosen destiny. Sometimes the greatest love truly was letting go, but in letting go, he had discovered that the bonds forged in spiritual purpose could never be broken by distance or time. The Guardians would always return when they were needed most, and he would always be ready to help them fulfill their sacred duties to the land and its people.